Hello, everyone. Hi, welcome. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Harvard Library, I'm so pleased to welcome you to this virtual event with John Reid, presenting his new book, Evergreen: Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet, joined in conversation by Maura O'Connor. In just a moment, I will turn things over to Professor Melissa Franklin, who will be introducing our program this evening. But first, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Thanks so much for joining us. Tonight's event is the latest installment in our Harvard Science Book Talk series, which works to bring the authors of recently published science literature to our Cambridge community and beyond. Our next Science Book Talk, featuring astronomer Philip Platt, discussing his new book, Under Alien Skies: A Sightseer's Guide to the Universe, takes place virtually on Wednesday, April 19th, and registration is now open on harvard.com. To learn more about this and our other upcoming events, visit us at harvard.com and sign up for our email newsletter, or check out the page harvard.com/science for more info on the science series. I will also be posting a link to our Science Research Public Lectures channel in the chat, where you can view previous talks you may have missed. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I will very shortly be posting a link to purchase Evergreen on harvard.com. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you to our partners at Harvard University, and thank you all for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and especially for science. And now I'm so pleased to turn things over to Professor Melissa Franklin, the Mallinckrodt Professor of Physics at Harvard. The digital podium is all yours, Melissa.
Hey. Hi. Well, I couldn't be more excited to introduce these two people. Reading their biographies made me want to run away and follow them. John Reid founded and ran Conservation Strategy Fund from 1998 to 2016, earning the MacArthur Award for Creative and Effective Institutions in recognition for Conservation Strategy Fund's innovative use of economics to sustain ecosystems. He now serves as senior economist for Nia Tero, an organization that supports Indigenous guardianship of vital ecosystems. He leads partnerships with Indigenous peoples in Brazil, Peru, and Montana. John studied English and Spanish at Amherst College and has a master's in public policy from Harvard. His writing on nature conservation has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the San Francisco Chronicle, Stanford Social Innovations Review, Scientific American, Manga Bay, and other publications. He wrote this book with a co-author, and the co-author, Thomas Lovejoy, until his death in December 2021, served as senior fellow at United Nations Foundation and university professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. Previously, he held senior positions at the Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment, the World Bank, Smithsonian Institution, and the World Wildlife Fund. Tom served on science and environmental councils under the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations. He received his undergraduate and doctoral degrees in biology from Yale University. And as I understand it, he was instrumental in bringing the Amazon into the conversation of conservation when it began. Our interlocutor, Maura O'Connor, is a journalist who writes about politics and ethics of science, technology, and conservation. Her work has appeared online in The Atavist, Slate, Foreign Policy, The New Yorker, Nautilus, Undark, and Harper's. She wrote a book, Resurrection Science, Conservation, De-extinction, and the Precarious Future of Wild Things, and was one of Library Journal and Amazon's best books of the year. Her second book, Wayfinding, The Science and Mystery of How Humans Navigate the World, is an exploration of navigation traditions, neuroscience, and the diversity of human relations to relationships to space, time, and memory. She's now writing a book called Ignition, which hopefully we'll hear about next fall, on fire ecology and prescribed burning, for which she became certified as a wildland firefighter. She is a graduate of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and was a 2016 Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. She lives in Brooklyn. Okay, I'm very excited to give the podium to you and to hear more about this new book, Evergreen.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thanks to Harvard and to the Harvard Bookstore for this invitation. And a big shout out to Maura. Maura, you can turn on your camera if you want, who's truly one of the great science journalists working today. And I highly recommend everything that she's written. What I want to do to start out here, I'm going to show a few slides about how the book came about and the forests that we write about in it. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully now you're seeing a picture of my co-author, Tom Lovejoy. So I wanted to start with remembering Tom, who died just a few months before the book was published, and show the way into how this book came about. So Tom is holding the leaf of a tree of the Cecropia genus here, and starting in the mid-70s, he set up a research project that looked at the impacts of forest fragmentation. And he did it by creating a set of forest fragments and controls in the Amazon near the city of Manaus in Brazil. One of the many things that the scientists found in this project was that there's a class of birds. One of them is called a leaf tosser. And these birds make a living by going along the forest floor, turning over leaves and eating the bugs that are underneath them. What happens in a forest fragment is that the edge to interior ratio grows a great deal, and you get a preponderance of these Cecropia trees. And if you can think about a bird trying to flip this leaf over to eat the bugs underneath it, you can see the problem that this class of bird had in a fragmented forest. So it was one of many species of various different taxonomic groups of creatures that couldn't make a living in a fragmented forest. So Tom was a pioneer in doing field research to show, what is the future that awaits us if we fragment all of our forests and we're left with little pieces. The other thing that he did was to look at a big scale, at a continental scale, really. And thanks to some work that had been done in the late 70s on the oxygen ions in rain in the Amazon, it was revealed that the Amazon was this sort of circulatory system of liquid water, water vapor, photosynthesis, energy transfer, in this endlessly ramifying diversity of life forms that was all really one thing. And Tom recognized that the biology, much of the biology that was being done was on too small a scale, and certainly much of the conservation that was being done was on too small a scale to keep intact these systems that were having interactions across thousands of miles of territory. So he was a crusader for big forests for many years. I came to this subject from a different angle, and really I had been practicing economics as a sort of pragmatic way to make the case for forests among those who may not be smitten by the birds or swayed by the absolutist arguments of just the wonder of the science. That is, the broader society that we need to convince if we're to prevail in our environmental goals. And there was a lot that we were able to do by showing the wastefulness of big development projects and the wisdom of setting aside protected areas and doing more sustainable forms of development. But where the economics fell down in its ability to show the true value and meaning of these systems was precisely in really large ecosystems, which are characterized by the abundance of their parts. And for any economists who might be in the Zoom salon tonight, what you know about things that are abundant is that they have low marginal value. So I had been scratching my head about, from an instrumental point of view, how do we make the case for these places that are the most rare and important, not only in a regional sense, but really important to sustaining our planet as a whole. And that's one of the things where Tom and I really converged in realizing that we couldn't have, having a planet without its intact forest is like flying a plane with one wing. And sooner or later, bad things are going to happen. So we came together in 2018 and wrote a small piece, an opinion piece on this subject, and that became the genesis of the book. The forests that we ended up focusing on are the five forests that are the most intact in the world. Two of them are boreal forests, you can see on this map, in North America and in Russia, and three of them are tropical, the Amazon, the Congo, and the island of New Guinea, and it's near outlying islands. And I just want to, before we get into the Q&A, give you a little quick tour with an image or two from each one of these places. So this is the boreal forest of Canada, and it's a spruce-dominated forest. This particular spot is in the Yukon. This is an image from the Sayan Mountains in south central Siberia in the Russian Federation, in territory that's the traditional homeland of the Buryat Mongol people. This is now to the tropics, an amazing, just super intact part of the Western Congo. This is a Western lowland gorilla here. It's munching on this incredible octagonal fruit from this huge tree, the Dubosia tree behind it. And it's one of the few places that all of these parts, animal and plant, of these ecosystems are working. And it's not just animal and plant, but it's people too. And that's something that we make a big point of in the book. A lot of the book is about people. The chap that's in this image is from a category of cultures that we know as pygmy, but it's a dozen different peoples with specific names. This guy is from the Aka culture in the Western Congo, and these cultures, the Aka and the other pygmy cultures, nobody knows how long they've been in the Congo, but it's somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 years. So they've had time to get to know the forest and are still the day-to-day guides, navigators, guardians, spiritual intermediaries of these forests. So to New Guinea now. New Guinea is a bird watcher's paradise. This is a kingbird of paradise that the guy in the photo, as we were walking along at night, actually just went over to a tree and jumped up and caught this bird, napping as it was. And the biodiversity of New Guinea is particularly rich at the species level because of its separation from everything else on the Australian tectonic plate. And birds of paradise are one example, but there are many. It's rich in orchids and ferns and many other taxa. 39 of the 42 species of birds in paradise are in New Guinea. And it's also the world's epicenter of linguistic diversity. So the man holding the bird speaks a language called Abun. Abun is an isolate, which is a linguistic term meaning that nobody can figure out any other language that is related to it. So it's like Basque, which can't be related by linguists to anything else. New Guinea has dozens of linguistic isolates and more than 1,000 languages overall. And one of the things that we spend time on in the book is this connection between the diversity of human beings, the diversity of their thought and language and way of being in the world that is correlated if you overlay that map of linguistic diversity on the map of the intact forest. They match remarkably. So for our last image here, we're back to the Amazon. And this is an image from the Indigenous territory I just spent the last month in. And it's a Samauma tree. And these trees are called mother trees by cultures in that forest. For one, because they're very, very big trees. They're the biggest tree in the forest. And also you can kind of make out in this image, but this tree is fruiting and it's absolutely covered with fruit, which feed so many different species that it's thought of as sort of the nutritional mother of the fauna in this forest. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it at that. And I thought I would just read a little tiny bit of the book before turning the mic over to Maura. And this bit that I picked out, I haven't read this before in an event, but when I opened the book this morning, something struck me about it as being good for today. And so trusting that this audience is interested in both science and culture, this is what I want to read. So this is in the last chapter of the book, in which we kind of recap the things that need to be done to meet the challenge of keeping our big forests intact. The patience we will need for this work is exemplified by the most forest-like building in the world, Antoni Gaudi's Sagrada Familia Basilica in Barcelona. Columns dappled with multicolored sunlight branch and spread into a canopy of serrated blossoms. The architect's Catalan modernist style transcribed nature into stone, iron, and glass. Nothing like it had ever been built. And when the masons laid the cornerstone in 1882, they likely had no illusions of seeing the end result. Gaudí himself died in 1926. Sagrada Familia, expected to be finished during the current decade, reminds us that such works are made by one generation after the other, each adding something to what the last one left. Our cathedral is to learn or relearn how to live on Earth. The parks, indigenous lands, roadlessness, and forest recovery we've advocated here are some of the stones we need to add to that cathedral right away. They are the contributions of our time. If the wooded nations do succeed in passing along to the next generation an Earth with megaforests, with vast expanses of what the Marubo people call Yoyovomai, or paradise, it will be because millions of people organized and called forth the twin forces of restraint and cooperation on an unprecedented scale. A shared land ethic will have prevailed over the small plans and ephemeral indulgences of our factions. Okay, Maura, over to you.
Great, yeah, thanks for those beautiful pictures and for reading part of the book, which, as you know, I'm a big fan of. And so, yeah, I'm just going to jump right into a lot of the subject matter that, you know, fascinated me and made me love this book so much. And as a writer, I think one of the things was that evergreen, in my opinion, subverts a lot of tropes in nature writing and conservation. And that's something that we've talked about a little bit between us, is some of the pitfalls of nature writing and conservation, and how we've struggled to identify those and avoid them and try to create new narratives around nature and wilderness, when maybe some of those concepts we find very problematic. So like one trope that I can think of is, to present to the reader how utterly dire a situation is. And, unless we can elicit their care, all is lost. So we need them to, to care about this subject in order to save X, Y, or Z. And like when you open Evergreen, it's like a wildly hopeful book. Like you actually, in places, it like took me aback, the picture that you and Lovejoy presented to the reader of this sense of possibility, that in fact, perhaps more than most people realize, there are these vast swaths of forest that are intact. It's quite powerful, and I wondered how much in the conception of the book you and him intentionally wanted to present, I don't know if you would call it hope or optimism, but not the typical narrative, to present readers with a different way of looking at this problem and what we need to do.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It was never a strategy of ours. And I think Tom and Tom was, and I am, we're happy people. And we are mindful all the time of the loss that's occurring, but also have this privilege of being in the presence of the sort of awe-inspiring natural world. And one of the things we wanted to do in this book was, it's kind of like we didn't want people to wheel grandpa off to the mortuary before he's dead. And we wanted to say, hey, this stuff is still out there. It's remote, and many people have not had the opportunity to get to the kinds of places where we work, and the kinds of places that we visited to write the book. And in the conclusion of the book, we report on the main thing that people would tell us when we went to those places, and we would ask them, hey, what should people back in the USA know? What should they do? How can they help? And the number one answer was, well, they should come, they should visit us, they should see this place. And I think that's because they're friendly people, but also there's an element to just acknowledging the world that we live in and the possibility that it has, and also keeping what we have is way easier than bringing it back. And so I think there's all that, and it's sort of a well-known psychological dynamic that if you scare the hell out of people with the doomsday scenario and the smoking clear cuts and all that, they will move on to something else that seems like a solvable problem. Mm-hmm. We think that's a solvable problem. And for the same reason that we wanted to show the beauty in the world that is, when we went to talk about solutions, we focused on reporting on things that are happening now that are working, rather than hypothetical things that might be tried out and either work or not work.
Yeah, that part at the end where you guys are talking to that individual who says, well, they should come and visit. felt really radical in a way. Like that solicitation to come to the forest and see what's there is like very different from this idea of like stay out, because when people are here, it's bad. Like you're ruining something that exists in a pristine state. And there's this thread, you touched on it, but there's this thread throughout the entire book, which is it is about people. Like you going into the forest and what you see there and who you meet there are people. And so it's very different from this idea that these are spaces that are unknown, unmapped, pure. On the contrary, there's these really fascinating examples given and individuals presented to readers about linguistics and culture and history and these locuses of human diversity. And so even that feels kind of radical within this like genre to me of nature and conservation writing, where we actually need people, I would argue, based on my reading of Evergreen, in order to accomplish this task. It's not about keeping people out, it's about forests with people in them, and that relationship that has evolved over 60,000 years potentially. So yeah, I mean, I assume that was very intentional. But yeah, how much of that is just based on you guys and your conversations initially, or just what you found when you decided to go on the ground and do the reporting?
I think it's a reality that we've both come to know over our careers. I grew up in Northern California, very much steeped in the romantic environmentalism of my culture that, going backpacking in the summer in places where nobody lives. And the idea of nature in that culture is a place without people. And that was an idea that grew out of the Industrial Revolution and the sort of the filth and the noise and the alienation that were part of that process of industrialization, and the romantic and real experiential value of nature that hadn't been transformed. In the United States, the reality is that the natural spaces that were created and that were preserved, thanks to our early environmentalists like John Muir, were places that had been depopulated. And so it's sort of, there's an original sin in our conservation that shouldn't make us reject it, because at that point in 1900, we could go one of two directions. Those places could be set aside and saved, or they could be privatized and industrialized and lost forever. Now, when you go to some other parts of the world where those processes of social change were not so devastating or not so complete, you'll find that even the forest that you think this is the most remote, this is the most empty forest possible in a human sense, we're finding people there. And part of the work that I've been doing in the last few years has been supporting the protection and rights of uncontacted tribes in the Amazon. And they're everywhere. And, all over the Amazon, much more secure and numerous in the more remote headwaters areas. But that's just one sort of indicator of the fact that people are out there. And as a good friend of mine told me, an Indigenous guy, he's like, parks can work, but not as well as our territories, because people come in here and try to, take things or exploit resources, they have to deal with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about some of the people and communities that you have been working amidst and learning from. There's a part in the book where you talk about how in the modern world, like we often think of forests as objects, And then people are these separate subjects acting upon them. And you give these, cutting, digging, clearing, gathering, all these things that we do to forests as something that's outside of us. And then you also point to this sort of other possibility where that separation is breached, or examples of people that don't relate to forests as something outside of them, but instead as like their ancestry, as their origins, the place of which they're born, and which is kind of profound to ponder and think about. So could you maybe speak a little bit to the different ways that you have witnessed how people relate to forests, to these big systems, and how that's different from people who've grown up in the West, typically think of and relate to these things?
Yeah, I'll give you one example. So I recently wrote a commentary about in response to some essays about animal rights, and the writer on the topic of animal rights was proposing really that people have an obligation to protect sentient animals from harm, and live with a separation, with no relationship, or the relationship at best being one of sort of cordoning them off from any sort of threats. The people that I spent the last month with in the Amazon, every single day, they are eating the meat of sentient animals, and not kind of more or less sentient animals. They're eating monkeys, they're eating wild pigs, and they're in an intense relationship with their environment that there's no other place that they can get food. So the health of that environment, the health of the wild animal populations, the health of the forest that sustains them are the most important thing there is, because there's nothing more important than eating. So in the photo that I showed of the guy from New Guinea who caught the bird, my thought when he pointed out, hey, there's a bird sleeping in that tree, is that maybe I'd get out my camera, and from a respectful distance, I'd put the flash on and take a picture of this sleeping bird. His impulse was absolutely physical engagement with this organism. And that's what I experience the most when I go to a forest where people are living from that ecosystem, that it's engagement on a physical level and on a spiritual level. And in a sense, the physical and the spiritual converge in that actual physical survival is the most spiritual experience that a person can have. And when the sources of that survival are close at hand and identifiable, those spiritual connections become very obvious. Mm-hmm. And everywhere I went, people had clans had their sacred animals. There were stories of evolution from particular animals, shared language, and in some cases, this is like one of the great unproven phenomena that I would love to be able to research, is the actual relationship between the sound of environments and the sound of languages, and where the actual, the music of the human expression comes from the surroundings. So does that begin to answer your question, Laura?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a part of the reason I was interested is because I think sometimes the language or approach of conservation has a similar objectifying distance in the sense of saving, protecting, conserving, maybe managing, but also leaving alone. And we're getting some questions coming in about, looking at the specifics of how you would begin to ensure that these intact forested places aren't, the focus of the level of industrial extraction that have devastated other ecosystems, and what that actually looks like. So on the one hand, in Evergreen, are you kind of promoting the idea of leaving alone, or more, can you get into more specific policy prescriptions after going to these places that you think can kind of apply to them broadly? And what would maybe like one or two of those be after your experiences?
We had three main recommendations. One of them is to acknowledge and reinforce the rights of Indigenous peoples to their ancestral territories. This has been remarkably successful in Brazil, where there's over 250 million acres of designated Indigenous lands. And the data show that these lands have lower levels of deforestation by a factor of 6 compared to traditional protected areas, and by a factor of 36 compared to undesignated or private lands. And that's not to romanticize Indigenous people. They're people with complex societies that have even more complex interactions with the modern world, but are rooted in places where generations going way back of their people have been there and have connections to place that just make things work out better for the ecosystems. The second thing that we recommend is traditional protected areas. This has been, where you've had, washes of history and colonialism, and in the old world, other forms of power struggles. The innovation of protected areas, which really came out of both Russia and the United States at around the turn of the 20th century, has been successful. And it is a good response to the historical reality of these ecosystems. And there's a whole lot of fine-tuning that can be done with different categories of protected areas that allow certain activities and not others. And it's, in December, the nations of the world signed on to a new version of the Convention on Biological Diversity that calls for almost doubling the area under protection by 2030. Hundreds of millions of people live in those areas. So very careful work has to be done on integrating the protection into the social realities of those places, or else it won't work. But that's the second of our recommendations, is we are definitely pro protected area done intelligently.
Right.
The third main recommendation that we put in the book is to keep roads out of intact forests. So
Yeah.
roads are the death knell of integrity of forests, and are usually financially and economically losers as well, but get built for political reasons. We saw in tropical forests, they have a certain dynamic that leads to a lot of deforestation or hunting. In the boreal forest, the fragmentation from roads also leads to overhunting, and even some dynamics between, for example, wolves and caribou that throw those relationships out of balance. So that's the third one. We do talk about carbon markets, and we do talk about reforestation in the book, and we give a good treatment of those. I think those, however, didn't make it into the top tier, as it were.
A subset of a question about specific policies and such was what agencies are best equipped to be successfully carrying those policies forward. And so, I mean, you come from, I mean, you're been in that world for a long time, so I expect you have an opinion about who you think the most powerful actors are in order to actually implement those. What have you seen, and what do you think, who's going to take that forward going, you know, into the future?
Yeah. So the most important actors are the national governments of the countries that still hold these places. Which could be worrying to a lot of our audience members. What I saw over the 4 years of the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil is that there's a lot of damage that gets done, and the sort of safety net is comprised of the nonprofit organizations, and in Brazil's case, the indigenous organizations that are working the judicial system to force the executive and corrupted legislative branches to comply with the country's constitution. So in other cases, the judiciary may have gone south, so to speak, and there's another branch of government that's still doing its job. But we need social movements to hold things together when the governments go off in unproductive directions. The other, in terms of other actors, the countries that have done a whole lot of emitting of carbon emissions and have great financial wealth have a role to play in financing the work of forest conservation. It's not free, but it is fairly inexpensive. It is in our country and in most others bumped way down on the list of government spending priorities. And we talk about the exemplary work that Norway has done over the last decade and a half to finance forest conservation in tropical countries. Norway is, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it's maybe the 25th largest economy in the world, and it produces oil. So some of this is conscience money, but it's nowhere near the top of that list either. And yet they're putting incredible resources into tropical forest conservation. So I'd say that's another category of agency that's important in getting this work done.
Yeah, I just want to encourage anybody who's watching to throw their questions in this Q&A box if they have them. I think we have about 15 minutes left, so now would be the time if there's something you really want to ask. I wanted to put out there that some of what I think sort of the average person hears a lot about these days is people in South America and in Africa and other places too, who are fighting for the protection of these places with like enormous risk to themselves. And I know you yourself have had, personal loss over the last year from people who have, been on the front line, so to speak, of these struggles and efforts. And so, yeah, I just wondered, since you are so very close to it and have been in these places that probably most of us haven't, can you give us a sense of the stakes right now and particularly for, people that you interact with on the ground, and how can they be supported, if they can, by people who don't live there and, but have concern and sympathy for what's happening?
Yeah. I don't know if I have an answer for all of your questions. They're all good. But they're not, there aren't easy answers. And the world works, or sort of doesn't work, in a sense, based on money and violence and power. And I've seen this firsthand in a personal way, and the response has to be continuing to to fight the fight, but trying to bring in resources to make it not an impossible fight. And so when I was, for this trip to Brazil, the person that I was traveling with, it has death threats against him. And when we were in vulnerable areas, we had armed guards with us 24/7. And that was through painstaking work that he and lawyers have done, and thanks to the change in government, with the sympathetic Justice Department in Brazil, to get people assigned to play that role. And now in the just in the last week, a major operation has started with federal police busting people for the criminal activity that was behind the murder of our friend last year. So in a sense, I think the only thing that sort of violence understands is an aggressive response. And in the best of times, the state can be dependent on to make that response. And in other times, we just have to privately provide our friends support and encourage them to lay low until things get better. But I said, I can't really answer the question, because there's vast areas of the world where people are not able to do the work that needs to be done. And Russia right now is the best example. The people that we interviewed for the book in Russia, none of them is working right now. And most of them are not in Russia. So I guess this goes back to what I was reading about before. It's like, this work requires a lot of patience. And I want to acknowledge that neither Tom nor I ever have run the kind of risks that many people on the front lines run as a matter of course.
I'm just curious, are you aware of the questions that Tom was, still interested in and pursuing? Were there scientific questions that he was, when you guys were on the ground, still asking himself, or things that he was still seeking to understand about forests? I don't know if you have any personal anecdotes from you guys traveling around the world together. I wish I had been there with you guys, fly on the wall, to hear what you guys were talking about during all these crazy travels into the, these wild places. But yeah, is there anything you could share with us about what he was thinking about and pursuing?
I think for Tom, the science was kind of in, and the question was, how can we move decision makers? He was very interested in the human political dimension of this problem, and was brilliant at getting through to people, very influential people in in South America, in Europe, in North America. As Melissa said at the outset, elevating the issue of tropical forests as a serious policy question at the World Bank when he was there, at the UN Foundation Smithsonian. He had a great deal of access in Congress. So I think, you know, after the Tom kind of figured out, you know, at scale, what's going on biologically, the question for him, and this is just my take, but the question for him was, how do we intervene in the human systems to get them to care?
Yeah. If anybody wants to jump in with a question or comment, and take this opportunity to dialogue with John, now would definitely be the time. I don't know if Melissa has anything that she would like to add as well, but this would also be a great time.
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see
Yep.
you.
Oh, well, that's good. Actually, you know, there was I read a review of this book in which it said, let me find it. I want to find the review because it was so good. The review said, I can't count the number of times I've watched Shark Tank and smacked myself in the forehead when someone successfully pitches an idea so simple that I get mad at myself for not making millions by thinking of it first. Reading Evergreen, Saving Big Forests to Save the Planet, caused me the same self-flagellation, but at a more existential level. Failing to conceive of a basic solution to an insignificant consumer problem pales in comparison to failing to see the forest for the trees. In Evergreen, authors John Reid and Thomas Lovejoy proffer a cure for combating climate change that's so elementary, it's shocking. We as a society haven't done it already. Leave the world's 5 biggest forests alone. I don't even know what that means, though. I wish I had the same, you know, forehead hitting things. What does it mean to leave a forest alone?
Where's that review from? I don't think I've read that.
Do you want it? I'll send it to you. It's from I should have said it's from the Washington Independent Review of Books, but I really liked it because
Yeah,
it's sort of,
that's
yeah.
cool. Well, I agree, and I think Tom and my challenge was not coming up with something wildly innovative to an obscure problem. It was writing about something that was obvious to us in a way that would be interesting to other people. And, you know, climate change is the big sort of magnet for pulling attention from our broader society into the environmental space. And forest conservation was not thought about in terms of climate change until, you know, sometime in the 1990s. And only really intensely in the early 2000s, when everybody in the forest conservation world, sort of the penny dropped and people thought, oh, now we have an argument people will listen to, like the world's coming to an end. The reality is, for addressing climate change, we need to do a whole bunch of things, and a sort of vast amount of them have to do with fossil fuel emissions. But what we try to get across in the book is that you can't think of this as just a carbon accounting problem. You have to think about it as, what kind of shape is the Earth in? Is the Earth ailing, or is the Earth healthy? Is the Earth a sustainable climatic biosphere system? And it has to be, and forests are a part of that equation. So I think that ideas that catch on in society have to be repeated a lot of times. And so we acknowledge that our book is, one beat on that drum. And what we're trying to do is make it clear, how forests play in the climatic system, and that the climatic system has to be thought holistically in terms of biology and physics and society. And I mean, what we try to do is make it as immediate and give as much texture and stories to these places as possible, so that people will think about them not as just a whole bunch of green space, but specific places with specific backstories and people and peculiarities.
So can I just, I know, I just want to continue one question. So suppose I had my own forest. So I have my own forest and I want to do the right thing. What do I do?
What do you do?
Or is that that's too easy a question. I apologize.
So not too many people will be in that category, people who actually have their own forest. But if you do, you can manage that forest so that it gathers more and more carbon, and so that the ecosystem is more and more intact. If it's a place that's been, say, abused in the past, you can restore it so that something like the original complement of species can live there. And those prescriptions will go to a restoration ecologist who will look at the site and figure out what needs to be done. But I want to take advantage of your question just to say that we do talk about in the book, what can ordinary people like us living in industrialized settings do? And because the climate problem is all one thing, and the biodiversity problem, in a sense, is linked to it, everything that we do in our personal lives to consume less and emit less help. And there are people who will argue, well, individual choices are too small to make a difference. But individual choices and corporate choices are linked, and they both have to change. And so, how you live in the world does make a difference. And it makes a difference in really remote parts of the world, because the number one threat that these systems are facing is climate change itself. And so whatever you can do to relieve the extractive pressure and to relieve the warming pressure is going to make a difference.
John, can we do like a quick lightning round of cool questions that have come in? Like, we'll go through them quick.
Let's do
it. So thoughts on ecotourism, beneficial or brings tourists, which brings development? Like where do you fall?
Ecotourism generally has a very small footprint. So I think that the perils of ecosystem based tourism are fairly small, and the upsides of giving people exposure and interest in the systems are pretty big.
Right.
So I would be an advocate there.
Okay. Have you interacted with Diana Beresford Kroger? She's a botanist, and her work gathering and planting seeds of trees that are going extinct. I think she's in Canada now, but she is Irish. I know Irish and English. Are you aware of her? Have you interacted with her before?
No, I haven't.
Okay. All right. Next question. So in the book, for me, and I think for you, you're also very interested in language. So some of that stuff in the book is like the most fascinating to me. And someone is interested in, the fact that there are thousands of languages in the forest. Does that mean that forests frame language? You have a great thing in there about rain and language, which is totally mind-blowing, but that's how they ask, do the forests frame language? What do you think?
Well, I would first of all suggest that the reader read the book or the questioner read the book, because we do spend some time on this and trying to figure out what's behind this correlation. And as Maura suggests, there are a couple of leading theories. One has to do with rain, and one has to do with physical isolation of cultures, and that's in the tropical setting. In the boreal setting, there are other dynamics at play. So I'll leave it at that in the lightning spirit of the questions.
Yeah, no, perfect. I mean, that's kind of the last one that came in. I think there might have been one more, but I can't see exactly what it is. If Albert Musa wants to restate their question, maybe we can squeeze it in here in the last minute, but
well, then I'll just say one more word about the language question. The theory having to do with rain, it has to do with the biological biological productivity of the system, basically the ability of the system to generate biomass. And that has the productivity of the system has an impact on the way in which people inhabit the system and interact with other groups, that leads to greater levels of full-blown language speciation, if you will, and as well as makes trees grow big and tall, and makes those systems dense in carbon.
Okay, so this question, the last one that's come in, I think what this person is asking is for people who live in the forest, like some of the individuals and communities that you've been describing, that you've interacted with in the course of your work, do they understand the importance of the forest to the planet itself at that sort of planetary level? Do they see the forest they live in as important at that scale?
So I would say there's diversity on this point. And some of them have heard that the forest they live in is the lungs of the planet. Some are quite sophisticated on that point and understand what the UNFCCC Climate Convention is and have been to meetings of it. And others, at the other extreme, I would say the forest is their whole world. Mm-hmm. And the idea of a world without forest is almost, it's hard to conceive of. And so it's almost like the forest is a medium rather than something that could be present or not. And I would say in those cases that the concept of the planetary importance of their place is maybe not so present in their minds.
Right. It's an interesting question. And
yeah.
Well, it's 7:05, so I think that was, yeah.
Wow, thank you both so much. That was really just a fascinating talk and sort of inspiring, despite the kind of depressing nature of what has happened. I appreciate that. I mean, it's like you said, John, we don't have to wheel grandpa off to the mortuary until he's dead, as they say. So as you said, thank you both so much. And thanks to our partners at Harvard, as always, and to Melissa for her introduction and her question at the end there. And to all of you for spending your evening with us. It's always a good way to spend an hour on a Monday evening. Please check out Evergreen on harvard.com. I dropped the link in the chat just a couple of minutes ago. And you can place your order there for pickup in the store or for shipping. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard Division of Science, the Harvard Library, all here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Keep reading, keep learning, and be well. Thank you all.
Thank you.